Hey everybody, welcome. Thanks for being here. Today I'm going to talk to you about a few subjects related to muscles. We'll learn about muscle strength and the different ranges of flexibility and how that impacts a muscle's strength. We'll also learn about how muscles use energy and how they attain that energy. To really understand this, you'll have to have a good grasp on muscle physiology and understand how muscles contract in the first place. And so if you haven't learned that, you should go back and check that out. Hopefully you find all of this clear enough and interesting, but let your instructor know if you need anything clarified. Now, the first thing that I'd like to talk to you about is how a muscle's flexibility or range has to do with the force that it can generate. You may have noticed when you're in the weight room or something, when you are either doing pull-ups or when you're curling especially, that when your arms are fully stretched out, it's harder to get started. And when your arms are nearly fully bent, it's really hard to get that last little bit. And the reason has to do with what's going on at the cellular level for the muscle cells. Remember that muscle cells contract by myosin proteins grabbing onto actin protein filaments and pulling them to the middle of something called a sarcomere. Now, if we think about this, we can see how it makes sense that when a muscle is overstretched, like when you're at the very beginning of a lift if you're curling, or when your arms are stretched out when you are initiating a pull-up, the actin and myosin are overlapping less, and so the myosin can't grab onto the actin as much, and therefore less force can be generated. At the other end of the spectrum, when you are almost at the end of your chin-up, your pull-up, or when you are almost at the end of your curling, the actin fibers are so close to each other that they start to bunch up and push against each other. And that pushing against each other makes it harder to further contract. Next, we'll talk about how muscle cells use energy and where they get that energy from. Now, to understand the role of energy with muscle movement, you first should review the contraction cycle. And remember that in the contraction cycle, that's explaining how the myosin and actin interact. And you typically start by describing that the myosin grabs onto actin filaments, that the head of the myosin pivots and pulls the actin toward the midline of the sarcomere. And then to release the actin, the myosin needs to exchange its spent ADP molecule for a fresh ATP molecule. Once an ATP is picked up, the myosin can let go of the actin, and it's still in its bent position. It splits that ATP. Remember, the T is tri, and there are 3 phosphate groups attached to an ATP molecule. It splits one off, and it uses energy released in that reaction to then go back to its original state, its open or cocked state from its bent state. And so there are 2 places where ATP is important for the contraction cycle, and that is to let go of the actin and to reset the myosin head. And just a refresher that the relationship between ADP, which is a low energy molecule, and ATP, which is a high energy molecule, is how many phosphate groups are on it. The D standing for di or 2 phosphate groups on it, whereas the T for tri or 3 phosphate groups. And so it takes energy to add an extra phosphate group onto ADP, and energy is released as that phosphate group is split off. So you just saw that ATP is important for the contraction cycle. The rest of today is going to be about how the cells go about attaining that ATP. And it's really 3 different ways that muscle cells can replenish their ATP when it's spent. The first way is by using creatine phosphate. Muscles have a lot of a substance in them called creatine, and when you're at rest, your body is adding phosphate groups to the creatine. That creatine can very quickly transfer its phosphate to an ADP molecule and creating ATP. And so this process is very quick, but you only really have enough creatine to last maybe 10 seconds. If you need an exertion for longer than 10 seconds, what your cell can do is anaerobic respiration or glycolytic metabolism. Glycolytic means sugar splitting. And it's just what it does, is it splits a sugar molecule into 2 pieces, and uses that energy to produce ATP from ADP. This process happens very quickly. There are not a lot of steps, but the issue is that it's not very efficient. You can only get 2 ATP molecules produced for every 1 glucose molecule used. And the waste product is lactic acid, which causes a burning sensation, and it causes the pH of the muscle and blood to drop. And because of these factors, this really would only be for an all-out exertion of between 30 and 60 seconds, depending on the person. When energy is needed for a longer amount of time, then the body uses oxygen or aerobic respiration or oxidative respiration. And what that does is it uses oxygen to split a glucose molecule, and you get much more ATP out. Depending on the resource you look at, it will say between 30 and 38 ATP molecules can be produced from 1 sugar molecule. The byproducts are only carbon dioxide, which you breathe out, and water. The problem, though, is that this takes a lot of steps, and so it's much slower. Oxygen gets into the lungs from the air, you breathe it in. The oxygen that the muscles use then goes from the lungs into the blood. Your blood has hemoglobin, which pulls oxygen. Now, to get the blood from the oxygen into the muscle cells have a molecule called myoglobin. It's very similar in structure. They both have iron, but myoglobin has a stronger pull on oxygen molecules than hemoglobin, and so it pulls it out of the blood. Now, different types of muscle cells or muscle fibers specialize in one or the other, whether glycolytic or oxidative respiration. And those are the different fiber types. You might have heard of fast or slow twitch, but really it is whether they focus on oxidative or glycolytic metabolism to create ATP. And they have specialties and special structures or adaptations to achieve those goals. The slow twitch are the ones that use oxidative metabolism, and so they are full of the things for that, full of mitochondria and full of myoglobin. And because of that, they are very fatigue resistant, but they're not very fast. And these are things like the muscles that you need for posture, your really most endurance muscles. Your fastest muscles, on the other hand, need a very large sarcoplasmic reticulum. Sarcoplasmic reticulum is what releases calcium ions to make the muscle contract faster. And so because you need such a large sarcoplasmic reticulum to make the muscle move faster, there's not enough room for as much myoglobin or mitochondria, and so they can't do oxidative metabolism as well. They need to focus on glycolytic. And those are the fastest muscles in the body. They are the muscles in the hands and the eyes. Most muscle fibers, though, are intermediate, and they have actually a combination of those two. They're somewhere in between. They might have a slightly larger sarcoplasmic reticulum than the slow twitch, but a smaller one than the fast twitch. They might have less myoglobin and mitochondria than the slow twitch, but more than the fast twitch. And so they are a little bit fatigue resistant, and it would depend on the person and the type of training they've done. Training can change muscle in a couple of ways. You can change the fiber type to some degree. Everyone is born with a certain ratio of slow and fast twitch fibers, and you can change it by doing different types of training. Training muscles also creates little tears, micro tears in them, which your body fills in with new muscle tissue. Training muscles also can cause the body to create a better blood supply or create more blood vessels into that muscle, creating more oxygen flow. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is rigor mortis. That's the stiffening of the muscles when an animal dies. When an animal dies, it no longer is taking in oxygen, and it is no longer making ATP. And what we saw is that ATP is needed for the myosin to release the actin in a muscle cell. And so with no ATP, the actin and myosin stay bonded, and it makes the muscle stiff. Eventually this wears off because the calcium also is diffusing out of the muscle, and it gets off of the troponin and tropomyosin, and so the troponin tropomyosin covers the actin binding sites, which eventually will push the myosin off of the actin, releasing and relaxing the muscle. Well, I hope you found that all interesting and relevant and understandable. Let your instructor know, though, if you have any questions, or if you have any follow-up questions that you have anything else you're wondering about. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.